The stones were cold beneath her knees. Eloan pressed her palms flat against the dungeon floor and focused on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, controlled. The kind of breathing that kept you from screaming when screaming was all your body wanted to do. Her hands moved to her stomach. Beneath the thin fabric of her dress, she could feel the swell of life she had been carrying for 4 months now. The baby shifted, a faint flutter against her palm, and the sob she had been holding back nearly broke free. Above her, torchlight flickered through the iron grate of the cell door. She could hear the guards on the other side, 2 of them, their boots shuffling against stone. They would not look at her. She had seen it in their faces when they had brought her down here. The way their gazes slid sideways, the way their jaws tightened. They knew who she was. They knew whose child she carried. And they had locked her in here anyway, because their king had commanded it. Their king, her mate. Theron Valeris had stood at the top of the stairs and watched them lead her down. She had looked back at him, desperate, searching for something in his face that she recognized. The man who had pressed his mouth to her temple that morning. The man who had placed his hand on her belly and gone, still when the baby kicked. The man whose breathing steadied only when she was beside him. That man was gone. What stood in his place was something she had never seen before. His eyes were flat and empty, black where they should have been gray, and the bond between them, the golden thread she had felt humming in her chest since the night he had claimed her, was ice, frozen, solid. She could feel him, but it was like pressing her hand against a wall of glass. He was there, but he was not there. Theron, she had whispered, and his name in her mouth tasted like ash. He had not answered. He had turned away, and the guards had closed the door, and the dark had swallowed her whole. Now Eloan sat on the cold floor of the dungeon and pressed her forehead to her knees. The baby moved again. She wrapped her arms around herself and held on. Hours passed, or minutes. Time did not behave properly in the dark. She drifted somewhere between waking and sleeping, her mind circling the same questions like a wolf circling a trap. What happened? What changed? What did I do? She had no answers. Only the cold and the dark and the fluttering life inside her, that deserved so much better than this. At some point, the torches on the other side of the grate burned low. Eloan's eyes grew heavy. The baby settled, and in the silence of the dungeon, something shifted. It started in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. A glow, faint and golden, pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat beneath her ribs. Not her heartbeat, the baby's. The warmth spread outward through her veins, down her arms, into her fingertips where they rested against the stone floor. The stones beneath her palms began to hum. Eloan's eyes flew open, light poured from her skin, soft and blinding at once, filling the cell like dawn, breaking inside a closed room. She gasped, tried to pull it back, tried to stop whatever was happening, but it was beyond her control. The light swelled, wrapped around her like a cocoon, and the last thing she saw before the world went white was the terrified face of a guard staring through the grate. Then, she was gone. When the dawn watch arrived to check the cell, they found the door still locked, the iron bars still intact, the chains still bolted to the wall. But the cell was empty, no tunnel, no hidden passage, just cold stone and silence, and the faintest trace of warmth still clinging to the floor where she had knelt. The guard who had been watching overnight was found sitting against the opposite wall, his face white as chalk, unable to speak. By the time Theron reached the dungeon, the entire lower level had been sealed. He descended the stairs with Kael, his beta, 2 steps behind him, and 12 guards flanking the corridor. His face was unreadable, but his hands shook at his sides. He stopped in front of the empty cell. His whole body went still, the kind of stillness that precedes something catastrophic. He stared at the empty floor where she should have been, where he had put her. The realization of what he had done, and what he had lost, arrived at the same moment, and the sound that tore from him was not a word. It was something raw and animal that bounced off the stone walls and made every guard in the corridor step backward. He slammed his open palm against the cell door, so hard the iron sang. Seal moved to his side, his voice low and carefully measured. "We are searching the grounds, every corridor, every passage. The perimeter has been sealed. No one entered or left through any gate." The Alpha King of Valdrin turned to his beta with eyes that held nothing but ruin. "Bring her back to me," he said. It was not a command. It was the sound of a man who understood, with perfect and devastating clarity, that he had destroyed the only thing that mattered. 6 months earlier, Aloan had not expected to speak to the king that day, or any day, for the rest of her natural life. Translators did not speak to kings. Translators sat in small windowless rooms on the lower levels of the palace and turned one language into another, and were grateful for the work. She had been employed in the royal archives since the age of 14, taken in as a child by the head archivist, a gruff, half-deaf old man named Aldrich, who had found her abandoned at the palace service gate, wrapped in a blanket, with no name and no note. He had raised her among books and old treaties, and she had repaid him by learning every language the archives contained, 6, by her last count. 7, if you included the old Valanthian cipher dialect that no one had spoken aloud in over 200 years. It was the Valanthian that ruined everything. She had been translating intercepted border dispatches, routine work, troop movements, and supply complaints from the Ashenmoor territories to the east. Tedious, repetitive, the kind of work that made her eyes glaze and her mind wander. But buried in the 7th dispatch, tucked between a complaint about spoiled grain and a request for replacement saddles, 3 lines were written in Old Valanthian. Eloan almost missed them. The script was disguised as a supply notation, cramped and small, but the moment her eyes caught the first glyph, her blood went cold. She read it twice, 3 times. Then she pushed back from her desk so hard the chair struck the wall behind her. The message was a coordination order, an assassination. Timed for the solstice summit in 11 days. The target was the Alpha King. Aloan stood in the corridor outside the War Council chamber and tried to remember how breathing worked. She had run from the archives to the upper levels, a distance she had never covered before in her life, clutching the dispatch against her chest like a talisman. The guards at the chamber doors had stopped her, obviously, because she was a nobody in ink-stained sleeves, trying to barrel into a room full of the most powerful people in the kingdom. "I need to see CL," she had gasped, because she was not foolish enough to demand an audience with the king. "The king's beta. It is urgent." The guards had exchanged a look. One of them had gone inside. Minutes passed that felt like hours, and then the door opened and Seal appeared. He was tall and lean, with the kind of stillness that suggested he could break a man's arm without raising his pulse. His gaze swept over her, assessing, cataloging, dismissing. "You are the translator," he said. "Not a question. There is an assassination order in the border dispatches," Eloan blurted, "written in old Valanthian cipher, targeting the king at the solstice summit, 11 days from now." Kale's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. He took the dispatch from her hands, studied the lines she had marked, and then looked at her with an intensity that made her want to take a step backward. "You can read this?" he asked. "I am likely the only person in Valdrin who can," Aloan replied, and immediately wished she had said it with less panic and more composure. Kale turned and disappeared into the chamber. The door closed behind him. Aloan stood in the corridor, her heart slamming against her ribs, and wondered if she had just changed the course of her life or ended it. The door opened again 4 minutes later. Kale stepped out and held it wide. "The king will see you now," he said. Walking into the War Council chamber was like stepping into the mouth of something vast and ancient. The ceiling vaulted upward into shadow. A long oak table dominated the room, surrounded by men in military dress and noble finery who all turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Torchlight caught the edges of maps and documents spread across the table's surface. And at the head of it all, King Theron, Valeris. He was larger than she had imagined. She had seen him from a distance twice in her life, once at a harvest address from the palace balcony and once crossing the courtyard on horseback. But distance had not prepared her for the reality of him. He was broad in a way that made the carved oak chair beneath him look fragile. Dark hair fell past his temples, and his jaw was set in a hard line that suggested he had been born frowning and had never found sufficient reason to stop. But it was his eyes that undid her. Gray, pale, and sharp, locked onto her the moment she stepped through the door, with an attention so focused, it felt like a physical force pressing against her chest. Aloan's legs almost stopped working. "This is the translator?" Theron asked Kyle, his voice low and resonant in a way that she felt in her sternum. "Eloan, sire. Raised in the archives under Aldrich." She identified the cipher. Theron's gaze dropped to the dispatch in Sale's hand, then returned to her. "Show me," he said. She approached the table on legs that had apparently decided to function independently of her brain. A chair materialized beside the king. Someone must have placed it there, but she did not see who, because every ounce of her attention was consumed by the effort of not tripping over her own feet. She sat. The proximity to him was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating off his body, like a furnace. She could smell leather and cedar and something beneath that was purely him, sharp and warm and disorienting. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the dispatch flat on the table. "Here, sire," she said, pointing to the 3 lines of cramped script. The cipher uses a substitution matrix based on the old Valanthian trade alphabet. Each glyph represents a syllable pair rather than a single letter, which is why it reads as nonsense in standard translation. She was talking too fast. She knew she was talking too fast. But his proximity had done something catastrophic to her ability to regulate speech. The message coordinates a strike team, 4 operatives embedded within the Ashenmoor diplomatic envoy. The phrase here, she traced the second line with a fingertip that she prayed was not visibly shaking, specifies the Solstice Summit banquet as the window, and this final line designates the target. "And the target," Theron said, his eyes on the dispatch, "is me." "Yes, sire." Silence dropped over the table like a stone into water. Then the questions began. They came from every direction. Advisors and generals speaking over one another, but Aloan could barely process them, because the king had leaned closer to study the cipher, and his shoulder was almost touching hers, and she had stopped breathing approximately 30 seconds ago. Theron silenced the room with a single raised hand. "Can you decode the rest of the Ashenmoor dispatches?" he asked her directly. "If they contain Valanthian's cipher." "Yes, sire." His gray eyes studied her face with an expression she could not read. Then he turned to Kyle. "Move her to the upper chancery. She works on Ashenmoor intelligence. Exclusively from this point forward. Full clearance. No one else touches those dispatches until she has reviewed them." Aloan opened her mouth to protest, to say that Aldrich needed her in the archives, that she was not qualified for intelligence work, that she was a translator who had simply gotten lucky with a dead language. But Seal was already gesturing for her to follow, and the king had returned his attention to the maps on the table, and the moment for objection had passed, before she had managed to form a single word. She followed the beta out of the chamber on unsteady legs, glancing back once as the doors swung shut. Through the narrowing gap, she saw Theron watching her leave, his gray eyes still fixed on her with an intensity she could not decipher. The doors closed. Eloan exhaled, for what felt like the first time in 20 minutes, and sagged against the corridor wall. "What just happened?" she whispered. Kyle, already walking, called back over his shoulder without slowing. You just became the most important person in this palace. Try not to let it kill you. The upper chancery was nothing like the archives. Where Aldrich's domain had been dusty and warm and cluttered with centuries of forgotten knowledge, this room was clean and cold and deliberately sparse. A single desk near the window. A locked cabinet for sensitive documents. 2 guards stationed outside the door at all hours. Eloan hated it immediately. But she did the work because the work was terrifying and necessary. Over the next several days, she combed through every intercepted Ashenmore dispatch from the previous 6 months and found Valanthian cipher embedded in 11 of them. 11. A coordinated intelligence network that had been operating under Valdrin's nose for half a year, passing information back to Ashenmore in a language no one alive could read. No one except her. She decoded them methodically, one by one, and each translation she completed was carried directly to the king by Kale. She never saw Theron during this process. Her world narrowed to the desk, the dispatches, and the locked door. She ate her meals at the desk. She slept in a small adjoining room that smelled of old wood and candle wax. On the 5th day, Kyle appeared in the doorway. The king requires your presence at the evening war council. He needs real-time translation. Eloan looked up from the dispatch she was annotating. Real-time? A captured Ashenmore courier is being brought in for questioning tonight. His field notes are in Valanthian. The king needs you beside him to translate as the interrogation proceeds. Beside him, Eloan repeated faintly. Kale raised an eyebrow. Is that a problem? No, she lied. That evening, she took her seat beside the king for the 2nd time. The first time had been chaos and adrenaline. This time was worse, because the adrenaline had faded and what remained was a devastating awareness of him. He acknowledged her with a brief nod as she sat. That was all. His attention returned to the documents in front of him, and Eloan busied herself arranging her translation notes, with the careful focus of a woman trying to ignore the fact that the most powerful man in the kingdom smelled unreasonably good. The interrogation lasted 3 hours throughout. Eloan translated in a low voice, leaning toward Theron to murmur her interpretations. Each time she leaned in, she caught his scent, cedar and iron and warmth, and each time something low in her stomach tightened. She forced herself to focus. The information was critical. Troop placements, supply routes. A second strike team she had not identified in the written dispatches. She translated it all, and Theron listened without interrupting, his body angled toward her in a way that closed the distance between them to inches. At one point, his hand moved to the table near hers, not touching, just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin radiating across the gap. She ignored it. Mostly. When the interrogation ended, the council dispersed. Eloan gathered her notes and prepared to leave, but Theron's voice stopped her at the door. Your translations tonight, he said, without looking up from the report he had already begun annotating, were exceptional. Eloan paused, startled. Thank you, sire. A beat of silence. He was still writing. Aldrich, he said. The archivist, he raised you. Since I was an infant, sire, he speaks highly of you. Another pause. An unreasonable amount, actually. I had to cut him off twice. The corner of Eloan's mouth twitched. That sounds like Aldrich. He also mentioned that you once accidentally set fire to a collection of irreplaceable 9th-century naval treaties while attempting to make tea on a translation lamp. Eloan's face went hot. That is a gross exaggeration. It was only 2 treaties, and they were not irreplaceable, merely very, very old. Theron's pen stilled. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she had entered his orbit, the hard line of his jaw softened by the smallest degree. Not a smile, not even close, but the ghost of something that might have become one if it had been given permission. Good night, Eloan, he said. Her name and his voice did something dangerous to her chest. Good night, sire. She left the chamber, walked calmly down the corridor, turned the corner and pressed her back against the wall with both hands over her racing heart. This was going to be a problem. The days that followed settled into a pattern that Elowen had not anticipated. She was no longer confined to the chancery. The king wanted her at every council session involving Ashenmore intelligence, which meant she was now in his presence for hours each day, seated at his right hand, leaning close to translate, her voice low enough that only he could hear. He spoke to her more during these sessions than she had expected. Not about the intelligence itself, though he asked sharp, incisive questions about her translations, but about small things in the margins of the work, Aldrich's habits, her years in the archives, how she had learned Valanthian when no one had spoken it in 2 centuries. I taught myself from manuscripts when I was 12, she told him one afternoon, sorting through a stack of decoded messages. Aldrich thought I was wasting my time. He said no practical person learns a dead language. And yet here we are, Theron said. And yet here we are, she agreed. He studied her for a moment longer than was necessary, his gray eyes thoughtful. Then he returned to his work, and Elowen pretended that the warmth spreading through her chest was simply the afternoon sun coming through the window. But it was not the sun. She began noticing things, small things. Things that should have meant nothing, but somehow meant everything. A cup of tea appeared at her desk each morning before she arrived, brewed exactly the way she liked it, with dried honey blossom and a sprig of mint. She had mentioned her preference once, in passing during a late council session. Once. To no one in particular. The guards outside her chancery door changed. The original pair had been stiff and impersonal. The new pair nodded to her when she passed, and called her by name. One of them brought her a warmer blanket for the adjoining room, without being asked. On the 7th day, Elowen arrived at her desk to find a book resting on top of her dispatch pile. It was old, leather-bound, and written entirely in Valanthian. A collection of poetry she had never seen before, never even known existed. There was no note. She looked up at the guard by the door. Where did this come from? The guard's expression remained perfectly neutral. Could not say, Miss. Elowen opened the book carefully, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar verses. Her throat tightened. Someone had gone, looking for this. Someone had searched the archives, or the private royal collection, or traded with a merchant who dealt in rare manuscripts, specifically to find a book in a language only she could read. That evening at the council session, she sat beside Theron and placed the book on the table between them. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the book." He did not look up from his report. "What book?" "The one you left on my desk." "I have no idea what you are referring to," Theron replied, in the tone of a man who absolutely knew what she was referring to. Elowen bit back a smile. "Whoever found it must have gone to considerable effort, must they?" Theron said flatly, turning a page. "Considerable effort and excellent taste," Elowen added. The tips of his ears went red. It was faint, barely visible in the torchlight, but she saw it, and the sight of the Alpha King of Valdrin blushing over a book of poetry sent a wave of warmth through her chest that was so fierce she had to look away. Something was happening between them, something that lived in the spaces, between words, in the silence, after a shared glance, in the warmth of tea brewed exactly right by someone who should not have known how she took it. Elowen was not foolish. She knew what this was. She also knew what she was, a foundling, with no family name, no bloodline, no rank, and what he was, the Alpha King of Valdrin, who could have anyone, who deserved someone, worthy of standing beside him. This could not become what her traitorous heart wanted it to become. She told herself that firmly, repeatedly, with the conviction of someone building a wall she already knew would fall. That night, alone in her small room beside the chancery, she pressed her face into the pillow and tried not to think about the way he said her name. She failed completely. The solstice summit arrived like a storm breaking over the mountains. Eloin had spent 11 days decoding every scrap of Valanthian cipher the border patrols could intercept. She had identified the 4 operatives embedded in the Ashenmoor diplomatic envoy by cross-referencing code names in the dispatches with the official envoy roster. She had mapped their communication network, their signal phrases, their fallback protocols. If the primary plan was compromised, she had done everything right, and she was still terrified. The morning of the summit banquet, Theron called her to the War Council for a final briefing. The room was tense, packed with military commanders and palace guard captains all speaking over one another. Aloan sat in her usual chair beside the king and laid out her findings with hands that trembled only slightly. "The strike team will move during the 3rd course," she said, tracing the timeline on the annotated dispatch. 2 operatives positioned near the eastern gallery doors. 1 embedded among the serving staff. The 4th will be in the musician's alcove above the main hall. "Above," Theron repeated, his gaze sharpening. "A crossbow position, sire." The angle from the alcove gives a clear line to the head of the banquet table. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Theron studied the layout she had drawn. His shoulder was close enough to hers that she could feel the heat of him through his sleeve. "You are certain of the timing?" he asked. The cipher specifies the 3rd course by referencing the old Valanthian word for turning point. In their trade language, that term was used for the midpoint of a formal meal. "Then we end it before the midpoint," Theron said, and something in his voice, quiet and lethal, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. The plan was precise. The 4 operatives would be neutralized simultaneously at a signal from Seal before the banquet began, before they could reach their positions, before anyone in the diplomatic party even knew what had happened. It almost worked perfectly. 3 of the 4 were taken without incident. But the 4th, the one assigned to the musician's alcove, had arrived early. When the guards moved on the alcove, he was already in position, crossbow assembled, sighting down into the banquet hall below. Aloan was in the hall when it happened. She had been placed at a side table near the king's position, close enough to translate any Ashenmoor communication that might surface during the diplomatic proceedings. She heard the shout from above, a guard's voice, sharp and urgent, and then the sickening crack of a crossbow releasing. She did not think. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She lunged sideways and slammed into Theron's arm, knocking him off balance, just as the bolt buried itself in the back of his chair, where his shoulder had been a half-second before. The hall erupted into chaos. Guards surged toward the alcove. Diplomats scrambled for the exits. Somewhere, someone was screaming. But all Aloan registered was the arm that had closed around her waist, hauling her against a chest that was heaving with adrenaline and fury. Theron had caught her. She was pressed against him, his arm locked around her like an iron band, his body angled between hers and the alcove above, shielding her. She looked up. His face was inches from hers. His gray eyes were wild, burning with something feral and desperate, and his hand was gripping her hip hard enough that she could feel each individual finger through the fabric of her dress. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. His voice was rough and raw. "No," she managed. His eyes searched her face like he did not believe her. His hand moved from her hip to her cheek, tilting her face, checking. His thumb swept across her cheekbone, and the touch was so unexpected, so achingly gentle after the violence of the moment, that her breath caught audibly. Something shifted in his expression. The feral intensity softened into something worse, something naked and terrified and wanting. Then Cale was there. Guards were closing in, and Theron released her so abruptly she stumbled. He turned away, barking orders, and the moment shattered like glass on stone. But Aloan could still feel the imprint of his hand on her cheek, could still feel the bruising pressure of his fingers on her hip, could still see the look in his eyes in that unguarded second before he let go. She pressed her shaking hands together in her lap and tried to slow her pulse. She failed. Later that night, after the envoy had been detained and the hall had been cleared and the bolt had been pried from the back of the king's chair, Kael found her in the chancery. "The king has asked me to thank you," the beta said from the doorway. His exact words were, "Tell the translator I am in her debt," delivered in the tone of a man who would rather chew through his own boot than admit he needed saving. Eloin almost smiled. Almost. "He does not owe me anything." Kale studied her for a moment, his expression carefully blank. "He also asked that your security detail be doubled. That is not necessary." But he was extremely insistent. Kale paused, then added, with the faintest inflection of something that might have been amusement, "I have never seen him insistent about anyone's safety before, not like that." He left before she could respond. Eloin sat at her desk in the empty chancery and stared at the wall. Her cheeks still tingled where he had touched her. She replayed the moment endlessly. The crack of the crossbow. The impossible speed of her own body moving before her mind had given permission. The bolt buried in wood where his shoulder had been. She had almost lost him. The thought landed with a weight that surprised her, because it should not have mattered this much. He was the king, she was his translator. The tightness in her throat, the trembling in her hands, the sick lurch of her stomach when she imagined the bolt finding its mark, none of that was proportional to the relationship they actually had. Unless the relationship they actually had was not the one she kept telling herself it was. But something else was nagging at her, a detail from the chaos that she could not place. In the moment when the crossbow had fired, in that split second of violence, she had looked at Theron's face and seen something flicker. His eyes had changed. Just for an instant, less than a heartbeat, the gray had darkened to black. Flat, empty, lightless, black. Then it was gone, and he was himself again, and she had told herself she had imagined it. But lying in her narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Eloin could not shake the feeling that what she had seen in his eyes was not fury. It was something else entirely. She did not have to wait long for answers. In the weeks following the Solstice Summit, the Ashen War threat was dismantled with surgical precision. The diplomatic envoy was expelled. The intelligence network was rolled up. The border patrols were doubled. Eloin continued her translation work, but the urgency had faded, and the nature of her time with the king shifted in ways she could not quite define. He kept her close. That was the simplest way to describe it. She was still summoned to every council session, still seated at his right, still leaning in to murmured translations of intercepted dispatches. But now, the dispatches were routine, and the real reason she was there had nothing to do with the Lanthian cipher. He talked to her, not about matters of state, but about everything else. He asked about Aldrich, about her childhood, in the archives, about the languages she had taught herself and why. And she talked back. She told him about Aldrich's terrible cooking and worse jokes, about getting locked in the restricted archive overnight and reading an entire shelf of banned romantic poetry by candlelight. She told him about the loneliness of being a foundling in a palace full of people who belonged somewhere. She had not meant to say that last part. It slipped out late one evening when the council chamber had emptied and they were alone with the dying fire. Theron had gone still beside her. "You belong here," he said quietly. And the simplicity of it, the certainty in his voice, made her throat tighten in a way she was not prepared for. She had changed the subject quickly, too quickly. He had noticed, and she had seen it in the slight tightening of his jaw. But he had let it go. That restraint was characteristic of him. He gave her space when she retreated. He did not push when she deflected. He simply remained, steady and present, and impossibly patient. And somehow, that was more devastating than any pursuit could have been. On the 23rd night after the solstice, the distance became irrelevant. Eloin was returning to the chancery from the kitchens. carrying a plate of bread and cheese she had charmed out of the night cook when she heard the sound. It came from the east corridor, the one that led to the king's private study. A low, guttural noise that raised every hair on her body. Not a growl, not quite. Something between a snarl and a moan, animal and human at once, laced with a pain so raw it stopped her in her tracks. She should have turned around. She should have found Kyle. She should have done anything other than what she did, which was set down her plate on the nearest windowsill and walk toward the sound. The study door was open. The room beyond was dark, except for the embers in the fireplace. Eloin stepped inside and froze. Theron was on the floor, on his hands and knees, his fingers clawing into the stone, like he was trying to anchor himself to the earth. His body was rigid, every muscle locked in a spasm of tension that made the veins in his arms stand out like ropes, and his eyes were black, not dark gray, not shadowed by the dim light. Black. The same flat, lightless black she had glimpsed during the solstice attack. But now there was no mistaking it, no rationalizing it away. His pupils had swallowed the iris entirely, and what stared out from his face was something that did not recognize her. "Theron," she whispered. He snarled. The sound was pure animal, devoid of thought, and it hit her like a wall of ice. His head snapped toward her, and for one terrible second she saw calculation in those black eyes. The calculation of a predator assessing a threat. Eloin did not run. Later, she would wonder why. Later, she would realize that something deeper than logic had held her in place, a pull in her chest that tightened when she looked at him, that screamed at her not to leave him alone in this. "Theron, it is me," she said, keeping her voice steady by force of will alone. "It is Eloin." The black eyes narrowed, his lips pulled back from his teeth. He was losing himself. She could see it. The man retreating behind something darker and older and far more dangerous. Then Kale was behind her. She heard the beta's sharp intake of breath, felt his hand close around her arm, pulling her backward. "Do not move toward him," Kyle hissed. "When he is like this, he does not know us." Guards appeared. 4 of them, moving with the grim efficiency of men who had done this before. They did not restrain the king. They simply formed a perimeter, keeping distance, waiting. It lasted 14 minutes. Eloin counted every one of them. Theron's body convulsed, stilled, convulsed again. The black in his eyes flickered, gray breaking through like light through storm clouds. His breathing turned ragged, desperate, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The blackness drained from his eyes, his body went limp. He collapsed forward onto the stone floor, breathing hard, his forehead pressed against the ground. Silence. Then Theron raised his head. His eyes were gray again, human again, and they found Eloin standing in the doorway with Seal's hand still gripping her arm. The expression that crossed his face was not anger, it was horror. "Get her out," he rasped. "Get her out now." Kyle pulled her into the corridor. The door closed behind them. Eloin wrenched her arm free and turned on the beta. "What was that?" she demanded. Her voice was shaking. All of her was shaking. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. He looked exhausted. "It is called the Ashen Moor Blight," he said finally. "A blood curse, laid on him during the border campaign 3 years ago by a dying war witch whose pack he had been forced to put down." Eloin stared at him. "A curse. He has been cursed for 3 years." The episodes were mild at first, brief, manageable. Kale's jaw tightened. "They are no longer mild." "How often?" Eloin asked. "Every few weeks, sometimes more." The healers cannot predict the pattern. He paused, and the weight of what he said next pressed down on her like a stone. "Marin, our head healer, believes the curse is accelerating. Left unchecked, the episodes will grow longer, more violent, more frequent." He met her eyes. "She gives him less than a year before the blight takes him permanently." The corridor tilted, Eloan pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. "He will send you away now," Kale said quietly. "He will say it is for your safety. He will be very convincing, and if I refuse to go?" The beta studied her with an expression she could not read. "Then, I suppose we will find out what happens next." The summons came the following morning. Eloan walked into the king's study, expecting a fight. She got one. "You are being reassigned to the archives," Theron said without looking up from his desk. His voice was flat, controlled, effective, immediately. "No," Eloan said. The pen in his hand stopped moving. He looked up at her, and she saw the shadows beneath his eyes, the hollowed tension in his face, the careful blankness he was using to hide how much last night had cost him. "That is not a request," he said. "And my answer is not negotiable," she replied. Her heart was hammering, but her voice held. "I am not leaving." His jaw clenched. "You saw what happens to me, what I become. If I had reached you last night before Sale intervened? But you did not. But I could have." His voice broke on the last word, and the sound of it, the raw fear beneath the authority, undid something she had been holding together inside herself. She crossed the room before she could stop herself, stood in front of his desk, and placed both hands flat on the surface, leaning forward until he had no choice but to look at her. "I am not afraid of you," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Theron stared at her. Something in his expression shifted, fractured, and for one unguarded moment she saw everything he was trying to hide. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the desperate, aching want of a man who had convinced himself he did not deserve to want anything. "You should be," he whispered. "Well, I am not, and you cannot make me." The ghost of a smile crossed his face, sad and wondering and gone too quickly. "No," he said quietly. "I am beginning to realize that." Eloan stayed. She stayed through the next episode, which came 9 days later. She stayed through the one after that, which came only 6 days after the second. She stayed while the healers conferred and argued and prescribed tinctures that did nothing. She stayed while Kale paced the corridors at night and Marin mixed compounds with increasingly desperate hands. And she did what she had always done best. She researched. The Royal Archives held over 40,000 documents spanning 8 centuries. Somewhere in that labyrinth of faded ink and crumbling parchment, there had to be a record of the Ashenmore blight, a reference, a precedent, something. She found it on the 19th day of searching, buried in a collection of war journals from the Thornfall campaign, 200 years prior. The text was written in an archaic Valdran dialect, dense and formal, but the account was unmistakable. A blood curse laid by a dying witch upon an enemy commander, blackened eyes, episodes of violent dissociation, escalating frequency, and one critical detail that made Eloan's hands tremble as she translated. The curse fed on isolation. It rooted itself in guilt and loneliness, in the spaces where a person convinced themselves they deserved to suffer. The more the cursed individual pushed others away, the stronger the blight grew. Isolation was the fuel. Connection was the counter. She brought her findings to Marin that evening. The healer read the translation twice, her expression shifting from skepticism to recognition. "This aligns with what I have observed," Marin said slowly. "The episodes worsen when he withdraws. When he sits alone in that study and convinces himself the world is safer without him in it. Then we do the opposite," Eloan said. "We do not let him withdraw. We do not let him push us away." Marin looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been pity. "Child, I have been his healer for 6 years. Keeping that man from withdrawing is like keeping water from running downhill." "Then we build a dam," Eloan said. She began that night. She brought her translation work to his study and set up at the small table by the window, without asking permission. Theron looked up from his desk, frowned, opened his mouth to object, and then closed it again when she met his gaze, with an expression that made it very clear she was not interested in hearing his objections. She worked in silence. He worked in silence. The fire crackled between them, and the room felt less like a cage, and more like a place where two people were simply choosing to be in the same space. An hour passed, then two. "You are very stubborn," Theron said, not looking up from his report. "I have been told," Eloin replied, not looking up from her translation. "It is extremely annoying. Thank you." The corner of his mouth twitched. He went back to his report. She went back to her translation. And something in the room settled, like a held breath finally released. She came back the next night. And the next. And the one after that. She brought tea and old manuscripts, and, on one occasion, a truly terrible sketch she had attempted of Aldrich, that made Theron stare at it for a full 10 seconds before asking, with genuine confusion, whether it was supposed to be a person or a root vegetable. "It is a portrait," Eloin said, deeply offended. "Of what?" "Of Aldrich. It has no nose. His nose is implied." Theron looked at the drawing. Then he looked at her. Then he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. The sound was low and surprised, like it had escaped without his permission, and it transformed his entire face. The hard lines softened, the tension in his jaw released. For 3 seconds, he looked like a man who was not carrying the weight of a kingdom and a curse, and a death sentence on his shoulders. Eloin stared at him, her heart doing something violent and wonderful in her chest. He caught her staring and went quiet, the laughter fading into something more intense, more aware. The air between them changed. "Eloin," he said, and her name in his mouth was different now, lower, rougher. A sound that belonged in the dark. "Do not," she told herself. "Do not do this. You are a foundling. You are no one. He is the king, and you are nothing, and this cannot happen." But her body was already leaning toward him, drawn by a pull so deep and so instinctive that resisting it felt like resisting gravity, and he was leaning toward her, his gray eyes searching her face, his hand rising slowly from the desk. His fingers touched her jaw. The contact sent a shock through her entire body, a jolt of heat and recognition that settled in her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. "I should not," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "No," she agreed breathlessly. "You should not." He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was desperate and consuming, like a man who had been drowning for 3 years had finally broken the surface and found air. His hand slid into her hair, tilting her head, and she kissed him back on instinct, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt because her legs had ceased to function. He pulled her closer, lifted her onto the desk, scattering papers and ink bottles. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had, everything she had been holding back for weeks, and the sound he made against her mouth, low and broken and grateful, undid her completely. "Tell me to stop," he said against her lips. His forehead pressed to hers, his breathing ragged. "No," she whispered. "Eloin, if we do this, I will not be able to let you go. I will not be capable of it. Do you understand what that means?" She pulled back enough to look at him. His gray eyes were raw, stripped of every defense, and she could see the fear in them. Not fear of the curse, not fear of the blight, fear of her, fear of what losing her would do to him. "I understand," she said. "I am not going anywhere." He studied her face for one long, suspended moment. Then he kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. What followed was overwhelming in the way that only inevitable things can be. He held her like she was the answer to every question he had been too afraid to ask. And she held him back with equal ferocity, equal tenderness, equal certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. when the mating bite came, it was instinct. A claiming so deep and so certain that the bond snapped into place, like a lock clicking home, connecting them at a level deeper than flesh, deeper than thought. She claimed him back with equal fierceness, marking him as hers, and felt the bond flare, golden and vast, and permanent between them. Afterward, they lay together on the floor of his study, because they had never made it to the bed. His arms were wrapped around her, and she could feel his heartbeat slowing against her cheek. "The episodes," she murmured against his chest. "I found something in the archives. The curse feeds on isolation, on guilt. Connection weakens it." She felt his arms tighten around her. "Is that why you stayed?" he asked quietly. "To weaken the curse?" She lifted her head and looked at him. "I stayed because I am hopelessly in love with you. You. Impossible, man." The curse research was a convenient, secondary benefit. The smile he gave her was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Fragile and disbelieving, and so full of wonder that it made her eyes sting. 3 weeks later, Marin confirmed what Eloan had already suspected. She was carrying the king's child. The joy was staggering. Theron, when she told him, went perfectly still for 5 seconds, then dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his forehead against her stomach, and did not speak for a very long time. But the joy was shadowed, because Marin pulled Eloan aside that same afternoon, her face grave. "The curse will not surrender him quietly," the healer said. "A mate bond gives him something to lose, something to love, and the blight feeds on what it can twist and pry." She paused, her eyes heavy with warning. "The stronger his love for you, the more the curse will try to turn it against him." Eloan felt the cold settle into her bones. "What do you mean? Turn it against him?" "I mean that the blight does not just feed on isolation. Child, it creates it. It takes the thing a person loves most and makes them believe." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a horror that Eloan could not yet fully comprehend. That night, she lay beside Theron in the dark, his hand resting warm and protective over the barely there swell of her belly. He was asleep, his breathing deep and steady, his face peaceful, in a way it never was during the day. Then his breathing changed. His body went rigid. His hand on her stomach clenched, fingers curling inward. And when his eyes opened, they were black. He looked at her. Through her, past everything she was, and into something the curse wanted him to see. And for the first time since she had entered his life, Eloan saw no recognition in his gaze, only threat. The episode did not pass. Eloan scrambled backward across the bed as Theron rose, his movements wrong in a way that made her skin crawl too controlled, too deliberate. The man she loved moved with a restless energy, an impatience that lived in his shoulders and hands. This thing wearing his face moved like a predator, conserving effort before a strike. "Theron," she said, her voice breaking. "It is me. It is Eloan. Please look at me." The black eyes tracked her movement, his head tilted slightly, assessing, and the gesture was so alien on his face that her stomach lurched. "Theron, the baby." She pressed her hand against her belly. "Your child, please." Something flickered. A tremor passed through his body, the briefest hesitation, like a man fighting against a current that was dragging him under. His hand twitched at his side, his lips parted. Then the blackness swallowed whatever had surfaced, and his expression went flat and cold and utterly empty. He spoke, but the voice was not his. It was lower, distorted, as if something else was using his throat. "Take her to the cells." The words echoed through the chamber. The guards at the door exchanged a horrified glance. Neither moved now. The command came out as a snarl that shook the walls, and the guards obeyed because their bodies responded to the authority of an alpha even when their minds screamed against it. Hands closed around her arms. She fought. She twisted and pulled and clawed, and she screamed his name over and over, but his black eyes watched her struggle with the indifference of a stranger, watching a moth beat itself against glass. They dragged her through the corridors. She saw the faces of servants pressing themselves flat against the walls. She saw Kyle sprinting toward the king's chambers. Too late, always too late. She saw the stairs descending into the lower levels, the torchlight guttering, the stone walls closing in, and then the cell door shut, and she was alone in the dark. She had lived this moment already. In the first breath of a nightmare she had not yet understood. She had pressed her palms to the cold floor and felt the flutter of life beneath her ribs and wondered how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Now she understood. The curse had done exactly what Marin had warned. It had taken the thing Theron loved most and made him believe it was a threat. Hours crawled past. The torches burned low. Elowen sat with her back against the wall, and her arms wrapped around her belly, and talked to her baby in a whisper, telling it things she needed to believe, that its father loved them, that the man who had done this was not the real man, that they would survive this because they had to, because the alternative was not something she was willing to consider. She told the baby about the book of poetry, about the morning tea, brewed exactly right, left on her desk by a king who pretended he had no idea how it got there. She told it about the way its father laughed, rare and surprised and so full of light that it transformed him into someone no one else ever got to see. "He is in there," she whispered against the swell of her stomach. "Under all that darkness, he is still in there. I felt him trying to fight it. When I said your name, when I said the baby, he almost came back." Her voice cracked in the cold silence of the cell. "He will come back," she said, and she did not know if she was promising the baby or begging the universe. "He has to come back." The stones were freezing against her skin. Her dress was thin, and the air was damp, and the cold had settled into her bones in a way that frightened her because it was not just her body she needed to keep warm. She curled herself tighter, knees drawn up as close as her belly would allow, and pressed her back into the corner where two walls met, trying to hold in whatever heat she had left. Then the warmth came, rising from somewhere deep inside her, from a place she had not known existed, a golden glow that pulsed with a heartbeat that was not hers. The baby's heartbeat, said. The light poured through her, filled the cell, and the last thing she saw, before the world dissolved into white, was the guard's terrified face at the grate. And then she was gone. She did not know where the light took her. She remembered fragments, the sensation of falling upward, the smell of pine and cold water, a brief, blazing awareness of the bond stretching between her and Theron, like a thread pulled to its breaking point. Then darkness. She woke on soft ground, surrounded by trees she did not recognize, in a forest she had never seen, with no idea how she had gotten there. Miles away, in the dungeon of Valdrin's palace, Theron stood before an empty cell. The black had drained from his eyes minutes ago, and what remained was a man, staring at a locked door with no one behind it. The memory came back in pieces. Each one was a blade. Her face, her voice, the way she had pressed her hand to her belly and begged him to see her. And he had looked right through her. He had given the order. He had watched them drag his pregnant mate, the woman he loved more than his own heartbeat, into the dark. His hands closed around the iron bars, the metal bent under his grip. A sound escaped his chest that the guards would later describe as the worst thing they had ever heard. A howl that was not quite human and not quite wolf, but something broken beyond the capacity of either form. "Find her," he rasped. And when no one moved, fast enough, the roar came. "Find her." Cale reached for his arm. Theron shoved him away with a force that sent the beta stumbling into the wall. Then he was inside the cell, on his knees on the cold stone floor, where she had knelt, pressing his hands flat against the spot that still held a trace of warmth, her warmth fading. He could feel the bond between them, stretched thin and screaming, pointing somewhere east, like a compass needle. But he could not follow it, could not reach through it, could not undo what he had done. The memory played behind his eyes in excruciating detail, her face, her hands on her belly, her voice saying his name, saying the baby, and the sound of it reaching through the darkness, just far enough to make his fingers twitch before the curse dragged him back under. He had been inside himself the entire time, watching, screaming. Unable to stop the words coming from his own mouth, they searched every corridor, every passage, every hidden tunnel, and forgotten cellar in the palace grounds. Nothing. The perimeter was sealed. No gate had opened. No wall had been breached. Kale stood beside him in the empty cell and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Theron pressed his forehead against the iron bars and closed his eyes. "What have I done?" he whispered. And the silence that answered was the loudest sound Eloan had ever left behind. The kingdom fractured around a king who would not eat, would not sleep, and would not stop searching. Theron sent riders in every direction. He dispatched wolves to scour the forests and mountains. He offered rewards so staggering that half the mercenaries on the continent turned their attention to Valdrin. He interrogated the overnight guard who had witnessed the light 3 times, with Kale present, to ensure the king did not lose himself again. The guard described what he had seen through chattering teeth, a glow, golden, pouring from her skin, like sunrise, contained in a human body. Then, she was simply not there anymore. No door had opened, no stone had moved. She had been swallowed by the light and taken somewhere he could not follow. Theron listened with his head in his hands. The episodes were coming faster now. Without Eloan, the curse had nothing to counterbalance it, and the blight surged forward into the space she had left behind. Kyle found the king in the corridor outside his chambers 2 nights after her disappearance, his eyes flickering between gray and black. His hands braced against the wall, fighting the darkness back through sheer force of will. "You need to rest," Kale said. "I need to find her," Theron replied. Through gritted teeth, Marin intervened on the 4th day. She arrived in the king's study, uninvited, set a stack of documents on his desk, and sat down in the chair opposite him with the calm authority of a woman who had been healing stubborn men longer than most of them had been alive. "The light the guard described," she said without preamble. "I have seen references to it before. Twice. Both in texts describing pregnancies involving latent Fae bloodlines." Theron's head snapped up. "Fae? It is more common than people think, particularly among foundlings, with no known parentage, dormant Fae ancestry, sometimes generations deep, that only manifests under extreme duress. A pregnant woman with Fae blood, under mortal threat, could generate a translocation surge. The child's power, combined with the mother's desperation, creates a spontaneous displacement." "Displacement to where?" Theron demanded. "Somewhere safe," Marin said. "That is the nature of the magic. It does not choose a destination. It chooses safety. The farther from the threat, the more powerful the displacement." She let the implication hang. The threat had been him. The magic had taken his mate as far from him as it could manage. The expression on Theron's face was something Eloan would have wept to see. Not anger, not frustration. Devastation so pure and complete that it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. "Can you track it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Fae displacement leaves a residual trace, faint but traceable if you know what to look for." Marin hesitated. "But Theron, if you find her, she may not come willingly. You put her in a dungeon. She was carrying your child, and you locked her in a cell." "I know what I did," he said, and the words came out raw and wrecked. "I know exactly what I did. The trace took 6 days to follow. 6 days of riding through forests and crossing rivers and sleeping on the ground, though Theron did not sleep. The blight would not let him, and guilt would not have let him, even if the blight had relented. Kale rode beside him, and Marin traveled in a wagon behind with her supplies. No guards, Theron had insisted. He would not approach her with armed men at his back. Not after what he had done. On the third night, Kale woke to find Theron sitting motionless by the dying fire, staring at his own hands. The same hands that had cradled her face. The same hands that had rested on her belly and felt their child kick. "You should eat something," Kale said. Theron did not respond. He had not eaten since the dungeon. His face had gone gaunt, the bones of his jaw standing sharp beneath the skin, and there was a grayness to his complexion that frightens Kale more than the blight itself, because it looked like a man who had already decided he did not deserve to survive. On the fifth day, the bond flared, a sudden pulse of warmth in his chest that made him pull his horse to a halt so violently. The animal reared. She was close, alive. He could feel her heartbeat through the thread between them, faint but steady, and the relief that crashed through him was so violent he had to grip the saddle to stay upright. They found her in a woodcutter's cottage, at the edge of the Thornvale forest, nearly 80 miles from the palace. Smoke drifted from the chimney. A vegetable garden had been recently tended. The front door was patched with fresh timber. Theron dismounted and stood at the edge of the clearing. He could feel her through the bond. A warmth so sharp and sudden it nearly buckled his knees. She was alive. She was close. The thread between them, stretched thin and aching for weeks, pulled taut with a longing so intense it stole his breath. The door opened. Elowen stood in the doorway, thinner than he remembered, her hand resting on the swell of her belly that had grown in the weeks since he had last seen her. Her hair was pulled back, her face was drawn. And her eyes, the eyes that had once looked at him, with a warmth that made him believe he deserved to be loved, were guarded. "Elowen," he breathed. She did not move. She did not come to him. She stood in the doorway of the cottage that the magic had chosen because it was as far from him as her baby's power could send her. And she looked at the man she loved with an expression that broke him more completely than the curse ever had. Fear, not fear of the curse, not fear of the blight or the blackened eyes or the snarling creature that had worn his face. Fear of him, of what he was capable of the possibility that the man and the monster were not as separate as she had once believed. "You should not be here," she said, and her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor buried beneath it. "I know." He stayed where he was, did not approach, did not reach for her. "I know I should not." Silence stretched between them, and it was nothing like the comfortable silences they had shared in his study, with the fire crackling and her translation work spread across the table. This silence was an open wound. "How do I know it will not happen again?" she asked. He had no answer. That was the worst part. He had rehearsed 1,000 things to say on the ride through the forest, 1,000 arguments and promises and pleas. But standing here, looking at the fear in her eyes, every word turned to ash in his mouth because she was right. He could not promise it would not happen again. The curse was still inside him. The blight still lived in his blood. And until it was gone, she would never be safe with him. "I do not know," he said. "I cannot promise you that." Her face crumpled. Just for a second, the composure she had built to survive, without him fractured, and he saw the grief and the longing and the love that she was trying so desperately to hold at arm's length. "Then why are you here?" she whispered. "Because I would rather spend the rest of my life earning your trust back than live another day without you, and because I think I have found a way to end this." He swallowed. "But I cannot do it alone." Marin explained it inside the cottage while rain began to fall against the windows. Elowen sat on one side of the room. Theron sat on the other. The distance between them was 6 feet and felt like 600 miles. "The Ashenor blight is not simply a curse," Marin said, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea She had brewed from dried herbs she found on the cottage shelves, left behind by whoever had lived there before. It is a living thing, a parasite anchored to your spirit at the moment it was cast. It has been growing inside you for 3 years, feeding on every dark thought you have ever had about yourself. Theron's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. The old texts, Eloin translated, describe a breaking ritual. The cursed individual must return to the site where the blight was cast and confront the spirit of the caster directly, not with strength. She looked at him steadily. With truth, the blight survives. Because it tells you lies about yourself that you believe. The only way to kill it is to stop believing them. And if he fails? Eloin asked from across the room, her arms folded protectively over her belly. Marin hesitated. Then the blight takes root permanently. He will not come back. The silence that followed was suffocating. Eloin looked at Theron and saw the resigned set of his shoulders, the calm acceptance of a man who had already decided he would rather die trying than live as a danger to the people he loved. "No," she said. Theron looked at her, startled. "You are not going alone," she said. "Eloin, you are carrying our child. I will not take you to the place where a war witch died and a blood curse was born, and I will not sit in this cottage and feel you die through the bond." Her voice was fierce and shaking and utterly immovable. "The last time you decided to face something alone, you locked me in a dungeon. So, forgive me if I have lost faith in your solo decision-making." The words landed like a slap. Theron flinched, but he did not look away. "She is right," Marin said quietly. "The bond between you is the strongest weapon you have against the blight. Severing it by distance weakens you both. If there is any chance of breaking this curse, it is together." They left at dawn. Cale remained at the cottage with Marin, and Theron and Eloin rode east toward the Ashenmoor borderlands alone. They did not speak for the first hour. The bond between them hummed with a tension that was part longing and part unresolved pain. It was Eloin who broke the silence. "The night you gave the order," she said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, "I could feel you through the bond. Not the curse you. Underneath, you were screaming." Theron's hands tightened on the reins. "I felt you trying to fight it," she continued. "For a moment, just a moment, you almost broke through. When I mentioned the baby." "I remember," he said roughly. "I remember all of it. The curse does not erase the memory. It just takes away the ability to act on it." His voice splintered. "I watched myself give that order. I watched them drag you away, and I could not stop it." Eloin closed her eyes. The anger she had been carrying, like armor, shifted, softened, became something more complicated and more painful. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. "Then we end it," she said. Today, the site of the Ashenmoor battle was a valley between two ridgelines, overgrown with thistle and wild grass. 3 years of seasons had softened the scars of combat, but the earth still felt wrong beneath their feet. Heavy, watchful, aware, they dismounted and walked into the valley on foot. Eloin felt the blight before she saw it, a pressure in the air that made her ears ring and her vision blur at the edges. Beside her, Theron had gone rigid, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. "It knows we are here," he said. The fog rose from the ground without warning, cold and gray and alive, curling around their ankles, climbing their legs, pressing against their skin with the intimate malice of something that had been waiting. And in the fog, a figure. She was old and small and broken, held together by spite and sorrow. The War Witch. Her eyes were black pits in a face that was more skull than flesh, and when she smiled, it was the smile of a woman who had been feeding on his guilt for 3 years. "You brought her," the witch said, her voice a dry whisper that came from everywhere at once. "How generous. I have been so hungry." The fog surged toward Eloin. Theron stepped in front of her, his body between hers and the witch, and the growl that ripped from his chest was pure, alpha, protective, territorial, human. The witch laughed. There he is, the king who slaughtered my pack. The king who put my son down like an animal and called it justice. Your son was a murderer, Theron said through gritted teeth. He killed innocents. I offered him peace. He chose blood, and so did you, the witch hissed. So did you, King of Valdrin. You chose blood, and now you carry it in your veins, and it will eat you alive. The fog pressed closer. Theron's eyes flickered. Black bled into the gray, and Eloan felt the bond between them shudder. He was losing Theron. She grabbed his hand. His fingers were ice cold, trembling with the effort of holding himself together. Look at me. He turned to her, and his eyes were half black, half gray, a battlefield in miniature. I cannot hold it, he gasped. She is too strong. She is not strong, Eloan said, gripping his hands so tightly, her knuckles went white. She is feeding on what you believe about yourself. That is all she has ever had. The witch snarled. The fog thickened. You believe you are a monster, Eloan said, her voice rising above the wind that had begun to howl through the valley. You believe that what you did in this valley makes you irredeemable, that you deserve to suffer, that everyone who gets close to you will be destroyed. Theron's face contorted. The black was spreading. I know because I believed the same thing about myself, Eloan continued, tears streaming down her face. My parents left me on a doorstep, and I spent my entire life believing I was not worth keeping. That I had to earn every scrap of love by being useful, by being small, by never asking for anything. The wind screamed. The witch advanced. But it was a lie, Theron. Their leaving was not proof of my worthlessness, and this curse is not proof of yours. She pulled his hand to her belly, pressed his palm flat against the swell of their child. You are not the worst thing you have ever done. You are not the dungeon. You are not the order you gave. You are the man who knelt on the floor and pressed his forehead to my stomach when I told him he was going to be a father. Theron's breath hitched. The black in his eyes flickered. You are the man who left a book of poetry on my desk in a language only I could read because he wanted me to know he saw me. Her voice broke. You are the man who laughed at my terrible drawing of Aldrich and looked at me like I was the most important thing in the room. The witch screamed, a sound like tearing metal. The fog convulsed. Let it go, Eloan whispered. You are allowed to let it go. You are allowed to be more than this. Theron's hand on her belly trembled. She felt the moment it happened, the moment he chose. Not strength, not dominance, not the roar of an alpha demanding submission. He chose to believe her. He chose to accept that the guilt he carried was real, but it was not all of him. He chose to stop agreeing with the voice that told him he deserved to suffer. The black drained from his eyes like ink washed away by clear water. The witch howled. The fog shuddered, thinned, began to dissolve. The figure at its center flickered, her black eyes widening, with something that looked for one brief moment like relief. Then she was gone. The fog was gone. The valley was just a valley, quiet and still under a pale gray sky. Theron fell. His knees hit the ground, and Eloan went down with him, catching him, holding him against her as 3 years of poison poured out of his body in racking, soundless sobs that shook them both. I am sorry, he said, the words muffled against her neck. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I know, she whispered, her tears falling into his hair. I know you are. She held him while the wind died, and the sky cleared, and the first pale shafts of sunlight broke through the clouds. Above the valley where the curse had been born, and where it had finally died. They rode back to the cottage in silence. But it was a different silence now, not the jagged, wounded quiet of two people, unable to bridge the distance between them. This was the exhausted stillness that follows a storm, when the air is clean and the ground is soaked, and everything feels raw and new and tender. Theron rode behind her, his chest against her back, his arm around her waist. She had not asked him to ride this way, he had simply lifted her onto his horse and climbed up behind her, and she had let him, because her body knew what her mind was still catching up to. The curse was gone. She could feel its absence through the bond, the space where the blight had lived, now hollow and clean, like a wound that had finally been drained. But trust was not a curse. It could not be broken in a single dramatic moment on a battlefield. It had to be rebuilt the way it had been built in the first place. Slowly, carefully, one small act at a time. Theron seemed to understand this without being told. He did not push. He did not assume that the breaking of the curse meant everything was forgiven. When they reached the cottage, he helped her dismount, and then stepped back, giving her space, watching her face for permission, before every gesture. "You do not have to be afraid of touching me," Elowen said that evening, standing in the doorway of the cottage while Cale and Marin prepared for the return journey. "I am not afraid of touching you." Theron replied quietly, "I am afraid of presuming I have the right." The words hit her somewhere deep, in the place where the anger had lived, and she felt the last hard edge of it soften. Not disappear, soften, like ice under warm water. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that made something behind her ribs twist. "You have the right," she said. "You always had the right. The curse took that from us. Not you." He lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the tremor in his breath told her more than any words could have. The return to Valdrin was complicated. Word had spread. The kingdom had watched its Alpha King tear the realm apart searching for his mate. They had heard the rumors, the dungeon, the disappearance, the pregnant queen locked in a cell by the man who should have protected her above all others. The whispers were vicious and relentless. Theron silenced them on the first day back. He called a full assembly of the court, every noble, every advisor, every ranking officer and servant and functionary who could fit into the great hall. Elowen stood beside him, her hand in his, and felt the weight of 500 pairs of eyes pressing down on her. 3 years ago, I was cursed by a war witch on the Ashenmoor border, Theron said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. The curse fed on guilt and isolation. It grew inside me, and I hid it from this court and from my kingdom because I was too proud to admit I was losing a battle I could not win with a sword. The hall was utterly still. Weeks ago, the curse took control of me completely, and I gave an order that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I ordered my mate, carrying my child, locked in the dungeons of this palace. A murmur swept through the crowd. Theron waited for it to pass. "She survived because she is stronger than I deserve. She came back because she is more forgiving than I deserve. And she stood beside me on the field where the curse was born and helped me break it, because that is who she is." He turned to look at Elowen, and the rawness in his expression silenced the hall more effectively than any command. "I do not tell you this to ask for sympathy. I tell you this because this court and this kingdom deserve to know what kind of woman stands beside your king." He raised her hand, the one still clasped in his. "Elowen Valeris, my mate, my queen, the bravest person I have ever known." The hall erupted, not in protest, not in scandal, in a roar of approval so sudden and so fierce that Elowen's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. The days that followed were not easy. They were never going to be. Trust rebuilt itself in increments, in the way Theron asked before entering a room she was in, every time, until she finally told him to stop asking. In the way he slept on the far side of the bed and waited for her to close the distance, which she did, night by night, inch by inch, until she woke one morning with her back against his chest and his arm around her waist, and realized she had stopped flinching. In the way he talked to the baby She caught him doing it late one evening, his head bent near her stomach. His voice so low, she could barely make out the words. He was telling the baby about the book of Valanthian poetry he had found for its mother, about how he had searched 3 separate merchants and a private collector before finding a copy, about how her face had looked when she had realized what it was. "Your mother accused me of having excellent taste," he murmured. "She was correct, but I was not about to admit it." Aloan lay perfectly still, her hand over her mouth, her eyes burning. He looked up and caught her watching. The flush that crept up his neck was so endearing, she nearly forgave him everything right then and there. "How long have you been awake?" he asked. "Long enough." He cleared his throat and sat up, with the dignity of a man pretending he had not just been caught talking to an unborn child about rare book acquisitions. "For the record," Eloan said, reaching for his hand, "I forgive you." He went still. For the book, for everything. The word everything hung in the air, vast and fragile and true. Theron looked at her, and she watched the last shadow leave his eyes. Not the guilt. That would always be there. A scar that would ache in bad weather. But the belief that he did not deserve to move past it, that he was condemned to carry it alone, that he was the monster the curse had told him he was. That was gone. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and slow and reverent, and when he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his hand cradling the back of her neck, he whispered, "Thank you? For what?" she asked. "For staying." "For coming back for every single moment you refuse to let me push you away," she smiled, her eyes wet. "You are extremely difficult to leave. I tried it once. The baby teleported me 80 miles, and I still missed you," he laughed. Low and warm and real, the sound she had first fallen in love with in a firelit study over a terrible portrait of an old archivist with an implied nose. "I love you," he said. "I know," she replied. "Even when you are impossible. Especially when you are impossible." The baby arrived on a morning in late autumn, when the trees outside the palace windows had turned to gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming rain. Theron held his daughter for the first time, with hands that had stopped shaking months ago. She was small and warm, and had her mother's dark eyes and his stubbornness, which became apparent within the first 30 seconds when she refused to stop crying until he held her against his bare chest and hummed a melody he did not remember learning. She fell asleep on his shoulder. The Alpha King of Valdrin stood in the center of his chambers, barefoot, shirtless, with an infant the size of his forearm tucked against his neck, and did not move for 45 minutes. "You are going to spoil her," Eloan said from the bed, exhausted and radiant, and watching him with an expression that made his throat tighten, in the best possible way. "Absolutely," he agreed. Months passed. The baby grew. Eloan returned to her translation work, with the baby in a sling against her chest, occasionally pausing mid-sentence to extract a tiny fist from her hair, or to prevent her daughter from eating a classified dispatch. Theron slept through the night, every night, with his mate beside him and his daughter in the cradle at the foot of their bed. No episodes, no blackened eyes, no fog. On a quiet evening in winter, Eloan sat in the king's study translating a newly discovered Valanthian manuscript while the baby slept in Theron's arms. The fire crackled. Snow fell outside the narrow windows. The room smelled of cedar and parchment, and the particular warmth of a family that had fought to exist. Theron looked up from the report he was reading, with one hand, the other arm wrapped securely around his sleeping daughter. "Eloan," he said. The nose in your new sketch of Aldrich is still not right. It is a perfectly good nose. It is facing the wrong direction. Noses do not have directions. That one does. It is heading east." She threw a crumpled piece of parchment at him. He caught it without disturbing the baby, because of course he did, and the smile he gave her, warm and unguarded and completely free, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They stayed like that, the four of them. The fire, and the snow, and the quiet. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the world felt exactly the way it was supposed to.